So now that I get the pleasure of following all the qualitative researchers, I thought I might start off with this one, okay? Doesn't say who's right or who's wrong. But anyway, let me introduce myself. My name is Annette Mills. I'm from the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. I am originally from Jamaica. I don't have a very strong Jamaican accent, but give me a few drinks and it'll come out. My research is mostly, I look at things like diffusion of technology, mostly at post-adoption use. I do more quantitative work than I do qualitative work, although my last two PhD students were mostly qualitative. Interestingly, one of them was co-supervised by Win Chin, who you all know is very quantitative. Well, we had a visiting person to our university, and he said, asking my student what she was doing, and she was doing a qualitative study. And his immediate comment was, oh, and Annette and Win were okay with that? So, of course. So anyway, so what I'm going to be looking at is looking primarily at measures. So primarily at how we construct measures and how those are informed. This is not a session that gets into SEM. It doesn't get into the technical details. So we have to remember that whatever it is that we observe is not necessarily nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. Now, very often in survey work, the things that we try to grasp hold of are things that we can't actually see. So what we see is only defined by the questions that we ask. So I'm going to see if I can get this to work.
It was 6 men of Hindustan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall. The second feeling of the tusk cried, oh, what have we here? So very round and smooth and sharp, to me 'tis mighty clear. This wonder of an elephant is very like a spear. The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, thus boldly up he spake. I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a snake. The fourth reached out an eager hand, and felt about the knee. What most this wondrous beast is like, is mighty plain, quoth he. 'Tis clear enough the elephant is very like a tree. The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, even the blindest man can tell what this resembles the most. Deny the fact who can. This marvel of an elephant is very like a fan. The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, than seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope. I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a rope. And so these men of Hindustan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong. But each was partly in the right, and all were in the wrong.
Okay, I hope that illustrates it. Let me see if I can get back to where I need to be. I think sometimes when we consider concepts, it's very much like that. And sometimes, in a sense, it becomes a place where the first person who actually conceptualized something and it gets published, that's the way in which we see it. And so therefore, it depends. Did you take hold of the tusk? And you assume that was the elephant. So we write a bunch of questions that helps us to understand what the elephant looks like, but all we're seeing is the tusk. And then the dilemma that we seem to have is that somebody else comes along and says, hey, this is what it looks like. It's like a tail. So I write a few questions, and we do our research, it gets submitted, and then what the reviewer says, you are wrong. Why? Because the elephant is a tusk, and you're using the wrong questions. How then do we convince someone that there are other perspectives for things that we can't see? So we see the things that based on the culture in which we are immersed. Very much it can be based on the theory that we have used, based on the measures that we have seen. One of the challenges is to actually is to go past that. So my talk is on counting. How do we count things? That's very much at the heart of any sort of studies that, that quantitative researchers often do. So it's about counting voices, whatever it is the object is that we want to count. Whenever we go to count something, however, we kind of have to make sure, are we always counting the same thing when we think we're counting? So these are a couple of the things that I'm going to have a look at. I'm going to talk briefly about measures, measurement, how did we get here, some of the challenges, and then I'll give an example from my own work. So what are we counting? Whenever we count stuff, okay, are we counting, for example, we say we're counting fruit, but one person understands it as a watermelon, somebody else understands apples, someone else understands bananas. When we define things, do people understand the same thing? If you're going to count something, then it needs to be the same thing. So when we create a question, does everyone interpret that question the way in which we intend? If you have a very generic one, for example, we're very familiar with things like some of the attitude constructs, perceived usefulness, and so on. What do we mean when we say, do you find a mobile phone useful? Okay. What would people think? Does it mean that I'm using it for a call or to make a phone call? Does it mean I'm using it to get money? If it's a smartphone, does it mean it's useful? Because one of the things I find really useful at night, I reach out, my hand hits my phone, and I got a light immediately. Okay, what are people using it for? What do people think of when they see your questions? So measures and measurement are at the very heart of everything that we do quantitatively. And of course, if it is qualitative work, sometimes we do also count things. So measures are a way of determining some sort of size, amount, or degree using something that is based on some sort of standard units. So if we do a questionnaire and we have a scale of 1 to 7, we assume that if one person circles a 4, then somehow it's greater than the person who circled a 2. Do they start with the same benchmark? Are they starting with the same standard? What exactly does all of this mean? If our questions are not very clear and people do not understand them the way we intend them, then in fact we could well be counting apples, pears, and bananas, and instead of saying that we are counting fruit, we say, oh, we're actually counting kiwi fruit. And in fact, nobody understands that that's what we're doing. But we need to have measures, because measures enables us to have control. It enables us from a quantitative sense to be able to predict things. So from a quantitative sense, whenever we write questions and so on that represent objects of interest, the only way in which we evaluate them is that we're always looking for relationships. So we look for relationships between one thing and another in order to determine that something actually exists. So theories. Theories basically tell us what the objects are that we're interested in, and then how they're going to be related to each other. So there's a whole raft of literature around theory of measurement which we don't think about anymore, perhaps too much. And one of the things that I have a concern about is that we spend a lot of time as researchers working on our theoretical framework, the broad framework. Then we spend a great deal of time working on the structural framework. So we say, this is how A is related to B and so on, but we don't spend as much time thinking about the measures. And our measures help us to determine, well, what our objects are, but by simply choosing certain questions, we immediately are implying some sort of a theory. We have two main challenges. So one of them is basically, well, how do we come up with measures or relations that can be interpreted numerically and at the same time they have some sort of practical relevance? Then we also go the other way. How can we have these relationships that have sound empirical or practical meaning, but they're succinct enough for us to be able to use them quantitatively? That's a key dilemma. I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but that is the situation that we're faced with. So we have the elephant. So we're invited to come and and observe and write about this particular phenomenon. So, like others, we say, well, how do we understand this phenomenon? We search the literature. So I will use theory X to gain some insight into this concept. Exactly, the only way to do it is we search the literature and we build on the literature. But first of all, the problem is that we have a fairly dim view. In fact, we only have a partial view of it. We write some questions and this is what we've come up with. Okay, so this is what we see. This is perhaps our reality, but then we move from here and we start making these conjectures. We start then making statements about what it looks like. And you notice this one is quite dim. I purposely did that because I think in the end, many of our concepts are quite obscure. It's not something that we see very well. A lot of work very often sometimes goes back and it draws on this particular article, Churchill, when we talk about how do we create good measures. And he came up with, recommended a process. The first opening remark was this. Okay, this was based on the marketing literature. More stupefying than a sheer number of measures is the ease with which they're proposed and the uncritical manner in which they are accepted. A lot of this then led to a lot of the structures that we have in place now that guides how we come up with measures. So one of the key issues that we have when we say, okay, we need to create things that belong to a particular domain is not just simply to come up with questions, but to have a process that we use to validate those. Perhaps the reason why very often a new set of instruments does not get accepted is because we don't go through a proper process. The truth is that we spend a lot of time to do it, but it requires a great deal of investment of time. If something does not exist beforehand, then searching the literature is probably not going to be very helpful. If you say there's a brand new concept nobody has ever looked at or tried to rationalize what the elephant's tail looks like, then yes, you can go to the literature, but sometimes you need to go to the field, okay? Check out a few elephants if you can. And this is where our qualitative work informs what we are going to then try to translate into some sort of quantitative representation. So today we're enamored by numbers and counting, but what is it? What exactly lies behind the numbers? What are people thinking of when they choose those numbers? We're often talking about constructs of the mind. A very common one, attitude. What does attitude mean when we refer to what's your attitude towards a particular object? And usually all we know are the answers to the questions that we ask. So the key is we need to ask the right questions. So I'll go through each of these particular points, but this is the set of recommendations on how we develop scales. So where do we start? First of all, if you have a construct, whether it's attitude, usefulness, I'm just using those as examples, persuasiveness, I saw one of those out there. The first thing is to understand exactly what is included and what is excluded. Where do we begin? We have to search the literature. If it's not in the literature, then you've got to get your knowledge from somewhere else. You've got to go into the field or something. If we say that this concept or this phenomenon exists, we need to go out and find some means of understanding what it is. Then we need to come up with a definition. Once we come up with a definition, then again, if it does exist in the literature, then you need to come up with really good reasons why it is that we need to have a new measure given that there are measures available. And one of the ones that we often get stuck with, is the TAM, is perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use. If we go to do a study and we use these terms, often reviewers will come back and say, why didn't you use these items? They have been used in thousands of articles. It is clear that this is exactly the only way, perhaps, to measure it. But we need to actually give reasons and evidence for why a new measure is better. So the next step is we need to then generate the items so we can use different means, critical incidents, focus groups, perhaps coming up with questions and then going back and asking people, well, what is your understanding of each of these questions? I'm appalled very often when I read a lot of work and people go in and say, oh yeah, they're existing instruments. So it appears that they've used a word processor and they've done find and replace by the object that they want to look at. Trust is a good example. Okay, we have ways of defining trust. We have very generic measures, but another way of defining it is in terms of benevolence, competence, and integrity. Now, I came across some work very recently that one of my students, she was searching the literature, and I'm not quite sure how an object like a phone or like a mobile phone or a website can be benevolent. Is that a characteristic that we would assign there? Yet still, this work is published in some of our top journals. We really do have to ask the question, are these measures appropriate? And not just use find and replace and reuse them. The next step, once you've come up with your items, then you may need to go through and shorten that list. And then you go through various assessments, determining whether or not something is reliable, looking at construct validity and so on. So I won't get into each of these things. But what I will say is that measures that are valid are reliable. Just because it's reliable does not mean that it's valid. Reliable is that it consistently measures the same thing. Valid is about measuring the right thing. So you can be consistent, but you're consistently wrong. Some common measures that we have. Very often we find it quite hard to get around some of these. So I've perceived usefulness, ease of use. The set from Moore and Bembasat, now those are cited in Rogers's DOI theory. So if anybody wants to say, for example, look at how to measure each of these dimensions that are mentioned, this one is given as a key reference. And there's some other ones that are going through here. Are these relevant to the work that we are doing in terms of what we want to do? These are just a couple of the questions. There's actually something else I wanted. Yeah, this is a slide I wanted. So these particular items, are we familiar with these? The whole list? Has anybody seen the whole list? How many people have seen this list? One person. Okay, do you know where this list comes from? We're familiar with the perceived usefulness items? Yep, okay, how many people? Perceived usefulness, we all know those ones. Okay, these are the original items. And if you've read the article, they're listed right there in the article, Davis, 1989. This is the original set, which he went through a huge process to refine down to about, I've highlighted a couple of items here. These are probably pretty close to the 4 that everybody uses. What can we observe about some of the other ones? These 4 are pretty generic, okay? Some of the others are very specific to the context. Sometimes, depending on what you're doing, the way in which to measure and understand a phenomenon is not to be very abstract, but it is to be quite specific. It means, though, that when you're specific and you understand what it is that you're studying, it's not necessarily transferable to another context. Every time we do research, we need to consider the context in which we are doing it, and then critically appraise whether or not the measures that we're using are appropriate, one, to the context, and second, to the phenomenon that we want to study, what it is that we want to get out of it. When Davis did this work, and he actually did, I think, 2 main studies. So there's quite a lot of work that went into this. He generated all of these. He actually went to the literature. So first of all, his definitions came from the literature. Okay, is this a good place? I don't know. I'm not going to critique it. But if you want to understand usefulness, perhaps the place to start is to start with the people who are using it, and then asking them what is their perception. Okay, but one place he started with to define it is to start with the literature. I'm not saying no, it just depends on your context. Then these items here were generated. This survey was tested with expert computer users Who are the people who are filling out your survey? What does it mean when we say that something improves my job performance? Do I really understand what this piece of technology is about? If I don't understand it very well, I'm not going to answer this question very well. Okay? Perhaps in some cases it's better to have much more specific items, and we'll talk a little bit also about the trade-offs with doing that. So the conventional wisdom is always start with existing measures if, and here's my, my plug here, if it is appropriate. If it is not appropriate, then what we're going to do is we're going to be drawing conclusions about something when we're actually measuring something else. So look at the literature. Determine whether or not the measures that you're picking are good measures. And if they're not, then we need to go into construct development, and that requires a lot of effort. We'd of course like to be able to publish it. Some journals have explicitly said they will not publish work on construct development. MISQ, ISR have explicit statements about that. Okay, so what they will publish is that when we develop constructs, it's not about the construct itself. We have them because we want to explain something. And that is the work that is publishable. Not just simply talking about the items or the variables in and of themselves. Then, of course, we need to assure validity, and I've just mentioned this already, limited scope for publishing. So, some of the guidelines, this is probably a better model to have a look at. This is clearly an issue that is at the forefront of our discipline today. This article came out in 2011. There's another article on looking at construct development that was published in 2014. There's actually a couple of articles coming out in our top 8 journals that are looking at this issue. So clearly, it is an important issue. And they're reiterating, this is very similar to the model that Churchill had back in 1979. Probably means that we're probably not doing a really good job at going back to those things. It needs to be reiterated in the field. So we've talked about a couple of these things: developing a conceptual definition, generating items, assessing the content validity, and then the fourth one is that we look at the measurement model itself. So here are a couple of guidelines just before we move to the measurement model. So this one came out in 2014. I would suggest that you have a read of this article. I think it's a really good one. It gives a practical, very practical illustration in a context in terms of how do we do measures. But the first thing is, do your respondents understand what you're asking them? Okay, you say, oh, I want to ask them about this particular device or this particular practice. Well, did you ask them, do you know what this concept means? Maybe it needs to be defined. Okay, in this particular article, they were looking at security practices and violations of security practices. So did people understand what it meant? Measuring the phenomenon concretely. So do you need to give specific examples so that people understand? Rather than asking someone, for example, to what extent do you comply with the policies on security in your organization? Now, if you ask me that question, I'll probably think, I haven't given anybody my password recently, so that's no problem. So I think about a few things. Quite honestly, I've never read the policy, so I don't know what else is in there. So I'll go, oh yeah, I'm pretty compliant. Okay, but do you walk out of your office all the time and leave your door open and your computer still logged on? Of course I do. I didn't think that was a security breach. So I'm going to tell you I'm pretty compliant, but I don't really completely understand what exactly the concept is. So sometimes we need to actually define it quite concretely. Ensure that your dependent variable is focusing on an important problem. This comes back to the relevance issue. Maybe talk to practitioners to find out whether or not this concept that we're trying to explain, somebody actually cares about it. The fourth one, ensure that it's applicable to the respondent's context. Sometimes there are terms that we use and that are not used in the organization. For example, if you go into an organization, you ask a lot of employees about their information system. But we know what it means. Does everybody else know that term? Or do they call it by something else? Is there, they know it by their accounting system, or they call it, we talk about the Oracle system and all of these things, but they might not understand your terms. So use terms that are relevant. And then the final one is ensuring that your measures reflect the level of specificity that you need or the level of generalizability that you need. If it's generalizable, if it's sort of at a higher level of abstraction, then it means that probably it can be used in other contexts if that's what you want, if that is important. For it to be relevant, however, sometimes it needs to be relatively specific for it to really make any sort of impact. This is a really, really quick look at SEM. We're not going to get into the details. So we're familiar with structural models. Is that thing up there? I think it's gone. The light's gone. We're familiar with structural models. We spend a lot of time on that. We look at different constructs. We work out how they're related to each other. But a measurement model is also, in a sense, very similar, because what we're looking at are relationships between our indicators, every single question that we're asking to identify a construct, and the construct itself. That should and ought to be driven by, although we don't specify, there is an implicit theory when we choose these questions. So the role of theory is something that I would say is extremely important. It helps us to determine whether the measures that we're using are valid for the context in which we are looking at them. So whatever it is that we are doing, whenever we create measures, we always need to go back to our theory. We always need to go back to our construct definitions and ensure that everything matches. When we go to interpret, it's always based on theory. I'm sorry, but if we've got the wrong questions, we are not measuring apples, we are measuring pears, but what we're going to do is we're then going to make conclusions about apples. So it is something we have to be extremely careful about. This is another concept that comes along very often. Should they be reflective or formative? This is about the relationship between the measures and the construct. This is something that needs to be thought about, I think, before we design the questions, because we are limited by what our tools can do. We might have great questions. We go through and we do all our field work. We say, here is a bunch of very relevant questions. And then we just chuck them all together. But in fact, they relate to our construct in different ways. So when we talk about something being reflective, we're saying that we have something out there and that these questions that we ask the answers are being informed by that particular construct that's out there. By formative, it means that the things that we're measuring actually impact that construct. Let me give a more concrete example. If I wanted to ask you, let's say you have kids, and I want to ask you if you could rate your ability to monitor your children, okay, on a scale of 1 to 7. There are 2 ways I could ask you. On a reflective sense, I'll assume that there is this idea of ability to monitor kids that I want to measure. So I can ask you, how good are you at doing it? On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the quality of your ability to monitor your kids, and so on? So a few questions, they're slightly different, but they're trying to tap into, they're assuming that this concept exists and I'm asking direct questions. I could ask it another way. I assume there are relationships between certain things that inform that particular construct. So I could ask you, how many children do you have? The more kids you have, the harder it is for you to monitor each one. I can ask you, how well can you see? You can't see what they're doing, okay? How fast can you run? Now, I know all of these are quite specific questions. The issue that comes up here is that if I forget the ones, if I overlook the ones that are most important impacting that question or that construct, I've got a bad measure. Because, for example, I want to understand your ability. So I ask you about your sight. I ask you about how fast you can run, how many kids you have. But I forgot to ask you, how well do you hear? If you don't hear very well, that could be the factor that's actually making a difference in how we measure things. So that's just one example. So the case of attitude. What is attitude defined as? Okay. This particular definition comes from Fishbein and Ajzen. It is something that I think needs to be defined in terms of a context. Perhaps you could just have a think of your research. Would you define attitude this way in your context of your research? Or does it have a different definition? Why? Can you give a reasoning behind it? Not just simply, oh, you know, my context is different and so therefore it's different. No, we have to have reasoning. We look at what the literature has to offer and then we see, well, what fits. And then what about the measures? So I'll just have a quick look at this idea of attitude. So it's a construct that's very central to most of our research that we look at behavioral prediction. That's our definition there. And models like, for example, TAM, TRA, TPB, and so on have not always been very consistent in explaining this link. I'd probably suggest, okay, and I might not be too far off, have you come across models that don't have attitude in there? They have perceived usefulness, ease of use, they're using all the TREs, TAMs, and so on, and they drop attitude from the model. Sometimes attitude just doesn't work. Now, a reviewer sees this, and what do you get? Oh, perceived usefulness is positive, ease of use, everything else is working. But what happens to attitude? It goes in the opposite direction. It's negative or it's non-significant. So they say, oh, something must be wrong. In fact, I know of researchers who've been asked to remove that construct from their work. My suggestion is that the problem lies in how we conceptualize attitude. So if we go back to some of the original conceptualizations of attitude, there were actually two components, two distinct components. One component was focused on the functional aspect, and the other component was focused on an experiential, more emotive aspect of it. If things are consistent, this is my assumption, if it's consistent, then it doesn't matter which part of the elephant you walk up to. You will basically measure the same thing. However, if it's not consistent, you will come to different conclusions depending on how you approach this particular idea. So this was the original conceptualization, or one of the earlier conceptualizations of attitude. Attitude essentially consisted of three components. Cognition, when we talk about beliefs, affect, that more emotive part of it, and conation, the behavioral part of it. For example, if someone steals, that's their behavior. Then if you're going to then measure their attitude, if somebody, say, for example, says, oh, I don't think stealing is right, but they steal, okay? You have a kind of conflict between their belief and their behavior. And at some point in time, it has to be justified. Otherwise, we'll go a little bit crazy if we don't. So at some point in time, that gets justified. Oh, I steal because they actually owe me or something else. What Fishbein and Adjusant did is that they basically did this instead. They, in a sense, created a sort of causal model. That is not the same as the top model. So what they basically said is beliefs now lead to attitude, attitude leads to, and by conation, we're talking about behavioral intention. So of course you're going to get a strong model. They're all sort of components of each other. And SEM is all about relations. So as long as these are consistent, you're going to get the same thing. So you're going to get really great, strong models. Is that really worthwhile? Okay? But that's where that one was coming from. So I actually did some work where I sort of, in a sense, I bumped into this. I didn't plan on it, but it was something that happened. I collected some data, and I'm only showing you a portion of the model here. So it's got your basic TAM stuff in there. So perceived usefulness, enjoyment, but I separated out attitude. So I had an evaluative component, and I had the affect side of it, the emotion side of it. And these were some of the questions. I removed good. Why do you think I removed good? There's one that says good and bad. Yes, but also it is one. Well, the other problem is that if you actually Google ambiguous words, good sits right at the very top of ambiguous. And so what happens with the word good is that I think it always takes the flavor of what is around it. So if I say, oh, do you find it useful? Do you find it valuable? Is it good? Is this fun to do? Is it really interesting? Is it good? So sometimes it has that ambiguity. So I don't have good in there. When I did this survey, these questions on attitude were at the very front of the survey, physically. The other questions were at the back, so they were not together. And what ended up happening is that these were some of my research questions. So is it okay for us just to look at the top component? Because that's typically how we measure attitude. Would it make a difference? And what happened in essence is that I collected data from two groups of people. One set of people who had been using mobile phones to access the internet, okay, and the other set who they were very aware of it, but they did not use it, but they probably saw their friends using it and so on, so they knew about the concept. For people who were using it, remember, they're actually now behaving in a certain direction, okay? So for people who were using it, it didn't matter which component I looked at. But for non-adopters, there was a huge difference in the models. And so my conclusion was that basically, if I had only measured the evaluative component, which is how it's normally done, in fact, attitude would not have worked. And it was because I was probably measuring the wrong aspect of it. So anyway, just to conclude almost, progress in IS depends on the measures that we use to estimate the variables that are of interest. And this is my last slide. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.